Margo and Ed, thanks for taking some time to connect this afternoon. Margo, first question for you. What do you think the role of story points is in Agile projects, and what are they?
Sure. Story points are estimates. They reflect an understanding of complexity and risk for a given task that is part of a larger project. The Agile team collectively decides on what story points will be appropriate for the task, and after it's been discussed during refinement or sprint planning. And then we use those to select the best mix of tasks to help us achieve our sprint goal.
And when you look at the accuracy of story points, how do PMs ensure that's actually true, that they are accurate?
So that accuracy will depend on the amount of information that's provided about the task. So if there's a lot of information, the estimate might be more accurate. So it all comes down to confidence. How much information we have on what needs to be done, the proposed solution, the technology used, and even the skill sets of the team. And then as project managers, we then work to improve all of those areas, get more clarity about those requirements, provide the time to research the proposed solution against our technology through a spike or other research task, and then give the team more opportunities to grow their skill sets.
And Margo, if you as a PM sense that the estimates are incorrect or the developers aren't being honest with their estimates, what would you do? How can you address that?
So this is usually an indicator that something else is going on. And the PM needs to find out why and what so that they can help the team feel more safe about giving those accurate estimates. Since the role of the PM is to protect the team, the PM should not be afraid to mention this as respectfully as possible, either in those refinement meetings when those estimates are being discussed, or after the sprint ends during the retrospective. So we should get to the root of the issue as quickly as possible and not let it go unnoticed. We need to help the team feel more comfortable to be communicative.
And just kind of as a retro question, in the past, perhaps in the waterfall days when people would work on a specific task, was it easier to look at this sort of estimation problem, or how long would it take back then?
I mean, I don't believe it was necessarily easier. It just ended up putting everyone under immense pressure to meet unrealistic deadlines. And so it's usually set by others who don't understand what was needed, what everything is going on. So it means the team's just burnt out too quickly. And that pressure to perform at levels that may not be reasonable, it's just not a healthy way to work together. I wouldn't want to go back.
Ed, from your perspective as a developer and architect, do you miss those old days of waterfall, or do you feel like Agile's been more effective?
I think it's more effective, and under good managers, I think it's healthier for the developers. I think what's happened is that we've moved the pressure from a release to the individual tickets in terms of accountability. So in the older days, you had two problems. One is that you're getting close to release and things either not enough was getting done or they weren't done properly. And when you're getting close to release and bugs are being reported, heroics are often required to sort of get it into the right shape. And that was sort of the big, approaching release was the big pressure point. Previous to that was, I'm working on this, I'm almost done, I got it done. But there were problems with that. One of them is that, developers would get lost. They'd be working on something and days would go by and they weren't making enough progress, or they were on the wrong path. And there wasn't sort of this idea that you're on a task we can help out with, that we can document. So that was a problem. The other thing is about the bad old days was that you could go, even if you were a senior developer, you could go off on a tangent away from the requirements when things were done in bigger packages. The shorter tickets gets you more feedback from the team and from users, and I think that's better. And I think properly managed, it is a more healthy, sustainable lifestyle for developers to spread out the accountability rather than have it be in these choke points. And so I think we are better off, although the culture is different around it.
Yeah.
And so specifically in Agile projects, when you're doing planning and refinement, how does the typical technical team member view the estimates, and what do they find challenging?
I think it depends what kind of project it is. If you're in a tight loop with sponsors or end users who are asking for features and they have deadlines and there's pressure to get as much done as possible, developers quickly figure out that their quality of life will depend a lot on what these estimates are. Some places I've worked, there's accountability. If you're off on an estimate, there'll be a meeting about why you were off, what went wrong with the process. So there can be a lot of pressure involved in that. And developers realize that, if I feel insecure or if I'm overworked, maybe I'll put a pad the estimates. And even if it's a team effort, the team can get into some sort of game theory where they realize, hey, wait a second here, everybody, like we're all in the same boat here. Us all deciding this is a 3-point ticket instead of a 5-point ticket, that may ruin somebody's week here. So there's sort of like this inflation that can happen as developers realize that you know, the size of the ticket, if it's wrong, you know, could have a really negative impact and could get them in trouble. So I do think developers can move into this protect themselves mentality about overestimating things to provide a buffer. And I think that happens throughout the project lifestyle. People, if they're not certain, can provide buffers. And if everybody buffers, that multiplies. Margo can confirm this. And then suddenly the estimates don't mean anything anymore. So I do think developers do feel the need, and that's only one way. I can get into more later, the way developers can game the system. But that's one of the most common ways.
Well, let's go there. That's really the next question I had. How do developers game the system, and how do you work with project managers to resolve that?
It depends why. I think Margo addressed the fact that, like, you know, what are the quality of the requirements? Do you really know it's ahead? I think sometimes developers game the estimates because they're not sure how to do it. And therefore, well, we'll leave extra time for the uncertainty. And I think that I worked with the PM ones who said, let's talk about that. Let's work through the uncertainty. What don't you know? And if there's unknowns you can't solve in a meeting with the sponsor, as Margo said, you can have like a research ticket or a spike ticket to find out those unknowns in a time-boxed way. And then once you know, document that, and then people will agree that the estimate is more accurate. So that's one way the game system is that can be handled that way. Another way is that they're just burned out and they just are thinking like, man, I could, you know, use a break here. And, you know, if I say this is a 5-point ticket, that'll let me breathe a little bit because I worked hard in the last few tickets, and it can sort of be a, you know, I need a break. A funny story is that I worked with a guy who I noticed always left early on Friday, who was getting his work done. And I didn't realize what he was doing is he went to his backlog and would look for an overestimated ticket, like a whole day ticket he'd get done in a half a day. And he'd start on Friday morning, finish it, check it in, take credit for the whole day and go home. And that, you know, it was like a trick he did. And then others realized, hey, wait a second, if I'm picking to the backlog, I'm looking for an overestimated ticket so I can just chill out for a couple of days, get that done, claim all the hours and move on. So I do think there's a mental health sort of relaxation thing. And that's probably best done by talking to the PMs about you being burned out rather than doing it through tickets. But I have seen that.
So Margo, this kind of brings it back to the discipline of the project manager. How should estimates be made and refined?
So obviously we're looking for as much information as possible in order to inform that estimate. And we get that through that solid set of requirements from the product owner that takes into consideration the needs of the end users, what provides the most value to the business. And then to the earlier point, making that research spike that takes a deeper look into the task. It's something that it requires a collective discussion. If you're not actually looking into it and maybe getting a little down and dirty into the tech, you might not be able to get to that resolution sooner.
But you can't overdo it though. I've seen over analysis also where I'll see 8 developers in a room debate for a half an hour about a half a day ticket. And once our team lead said, we just spent the whole ticket on the debate about the ticket because we overthought, you know, describing the ticket. And I'm all for saying, put in as much detail as possible in order to let the widest range of developers work on it, because the more that's there, the less you have to be the person who worked on the last piece of that. But you can also overdo it. You can spend a lot of group time refining where it wasn't that big a ticket to begin with. So you do have to say, okay, I think we know enough. Let's not debate everything that could go wrong here, because then you're using real time that would be best put into the ticket. So that doesn't happen that often, but I do think you can overdo it on the notes on ticket.
So Margo, when you think about that, how many people should be involved in the estimation project? We certainly don't want 8 developers sitting in a room thinking about story points.
Well, I mean, in some cases that might be what's needed in order to get through some of the really large, complex things that involve a lot of areas. You're going to have, you know, the design that needs to be weighed in. You got front end considerations, back end considerations. There's a ton of things that could be discussed. However, if you have a product owner with a good understanding of the users, the Agile team can really just benefit from a lot of that upfront work. And you want to make sure that in those refinement meetings, when some of that discussion's happening, everyone's getting together and discussing those facets, but the PM is there to basically curtail some of those extraneous conversations and know where to draw the line. It's something that happens with time and the comfort with the team to know where something's gone a little too far off the beaten path and you want to kind of move things back into line.
So Ed, allowing you to kind of spool out a little further, what does go right and wrong in story point estimates for the tech team?
What goes right is thinking critically about refinement, is to say, like, let's not take it for granted. Let's put in everything. One of the rules I used to have was say, what can happen in a refinement meeting is the person who's the best or the most familiar with an area, if he does the estimate, that's okay in a way. But if someone else picks up the ticket who doesn't have that experience, that can go wrong. So I think one of the things I recommend is that pretend that the person who isn't the most knowledgeable is going to work on it, and pretend they are going to pick it up. Put in all the context that one person may already have in his or her head, but get it in the tickets. I'm all for putting it all in there. I think another thing is to say, communicate. I don't think we know enough, or put your hand up right away and say, sign a ticket, like, I think I might work on that. And I'm sorry, I know I should know this, but how do I do that? Or how do I get that resource that's required? I think early communication is hugely important. Documenting things you don't think you need to document because you don't know for sure who's going to pick up the ticket. And I think that's often an error when the person who says the 3 gives the person without the context, and it becomes a 5 in their hands because they didn't have that background information that could have been attached to the ticket. So I think creating a ticket description for anyone is one way to mitigate the risk of it being handed off to someone else. And therefore, nobody trips over the fact that they didn't know where that password was and they lost a couple hours on all that. So I do think that really paying attention in refinement, getting the ticket really, really right, I think is a great way to defend against, all kinds of wasted time trying to execute.
So does that game theory occur when people end up trying to help one another?
Yeah, it does, because you realize that the person who might work on it, it maybe is more junior, and we'll make it a bigger one. You can't stop game theory. I think that it's for the PM and technical team lead to manage that, right? Mm-hmm. So if everybody's had a rough time and they have a few more tickets to do, I think it's okay to inflate the tickets a little bit, or maybe it's better for the PM to find time for them to sort of like pull back a little bit and get some R&R. So I do think that you're always going to have people kind of subconsciously cooperating. And I think as long as they're in a cooperative mode and they're doing what's good for the end user and for the business, I think it can be managed. There's always going to be, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back. If you want a team to be collaborative, which is what we want, they're going to collaborate on a lot of different things. I think it's okay to a point. If you feel like they just gotten out of hand where they're really inflating the estimates, or they're kind of losing their drive, then I think a PM has to step in. I think it's a question of keeping it in check rather than pretending that, a team isn't going to be sort of looking out for each other. I think it's all about good management.
So Margo, turning back to solutioning a little bit, how do you prevent people from padding estimates?
You have to look at what the padding really stands for. In some cases, if it's burnout, we can address that. It might be that they want to make sure that there's enough time to get feedback from somebody or work with another team member. So you want to make sure that, everyone's comfortable with what the estimate really would entail. So I might ask a few pointed questions to that realm. But I also, may push back on something outside of the team. I may push back on using metrics that utilize story points or sprint velocity in a way that punishes the team, that may start some of those from actually starting. Because if the story points cause risk and we're taking on high story point tasks, it means we're working on more complex work. That carries a lot of downstream impact. I want the team to know it's okay to take that quality time to work together, to complete that work, even if it means our velocity and the amount of story points we might complete kind of decrease for a particular sprint or a couple sprints. So when those tasks that carry those story points carry a lot of risk, we can also then break those down, find other ways to collaborate, work together to make them easier to complete by the team.
Yeah, and I've seen people become afraid of 5-point stories because they're worried they can't handle the complexity. I see a big problem is that the bigger the number gets, the more people don't want to work in them. Oh my goodness, so much could go wrong with a 5-point story. Yeah. And I think that I used to joke that like developers want the mythical 4-point story where it's doable but won't get out of hand, in terms of the jump between 3 and 5 in the sequence. And I do think that people get worried, oh God, that could become a morass, 5 points, a lot could go wrong. And I think if the team talks about it, and if the PMs are trying to, as you say, like anticipate problems and talk about it, I think you can get through it. But I have seen developers, I want the 1 and 3 point stories only because those are the ones I know I can knock out. The 5 point is nothing but downside for me. So I do think that PMs have to be careful and say, wait, if that person over there, if she's always picking the 1 point story, maybe she's worried about what would happen with the 5 point and we have to work with that person. So I think these points, I know it sounds silly, but I think these points really matter in terms of projects and getting stuff done and lifestyle. I'm glad we're talking about them.
It's communication and empathy. You want what's best for the team, what makes the team's work most valuable for themselves. Everyone's going to feel some pride in their work, but also, pride in the project and what they're putting out.
Well, it's nice to see project managers and technical leaders find common ground to discuss story point estimates and be candid and transparent. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.